One more member that's on his way in. Anything that could be dire and ominous that has anything to do with QBE. I've heard that question here the last little bit. No, QBE was done 40 plus years ago. The way we educate our children has changed in that time period. And what this committee is to look at is, are we allocating the resources to the areas of education that are most appropriate today? And I'm just using some of these as an example, like school counselors. It was a little different 40 years ago than it is today. Addressing mental health needs within the schools. And see, I even got Nan going, right off the bat. So this is going to be a good meeting. It's a little different than it was 40 years ago. So if you're, I understand where we are in the building and people get anxious as soon as they hear a term. That's what we're looking at is, are we applying the resources in the most effective way to best educate our children moving forward? Does everybody go with that? All right. And I was trying to stretch that out as long as I could till Senator Tippins got here. I'm going to need to keep talking.
Nice time, you know.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So to know that you'll go easy on us, today is my birthday. And I could think of no better place to be than here with y'all talking QBE. And I hope Lindsay gets here quick because I'm running out of political stories to tell here. Oh yeah, let's do that. Let's start right here with Senator Orrock. What number are you? Okay.
Nan Orrock, Senate District 36, representing Atlanta, East Point, College Park, and Hateville in Fulton County.
Oh, hold on. How long have you been in the Senate here, Senator?
I was sworn in 2007.
Have you seen us talk about QBE before?
Well, indeed, Senator Tippins served on the last panel that took a deep dive into QBE.
Okay. Thank you.
It has been, it's a topic that when I came here, Governor Joe Frank Harris had just recently wrapped up the statewide look at education and come up with, you know, the QBE was law when I arrived here in the House.
Which is why you were on this study committee, because you have a wealth of knowledge and history that will help us prevent from making mistakes that we may have made before. So thank you for being on this committee. Senator Hickman.
Yes, sir. Number 8. Yes, I'm Senator Billy Hickman from Statesboro, Georgia, Senate District 4. I'm very fortunate to be represented the same Senate district that the late Jack Hill represented. And so very fortunate for that. But that also has given me a lot of incentives to do things too. I'm married to a retired teacher, 3rd and 5th grade. And we have 2 daughter-in-laws, and both of them are teachers. One teaches for the Cyber Academy and one teaches 6th grade science. So I'm very in tune to this, and more I've learned about through this process is getting ready for this today and just going through schools and talking to people and all, the more I'm interested in this. I'm very disturbed by the fact that, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm very disturbed by the fact that we're for the 8th year in a row, we're the best state in the United States to do business in, but yet our school system ranks in the bottom 1/3 in the nation. And so that's why we need to be here. I've studied the QBE stuff. I appreciate it, but thank y'all. I'm looking forward to a great meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Tippins, would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
I'm Lindsay Tippins. I'm proud to be here.
What school experience do you have, Senator?
I spent 3 years in 7th grade, so I have extensive knowledge about middle school. I was on the Cobb Board of Education for 12 years, served in the Senate for 12 years, on the Senate Education Committee for 8, chaired it 6, and have chaired higher ed for the last 4. Other than that, I know very little.
Senator Payne.
Senator Chuck Payne from Dalton, Georgia, and I represent 54th Senate District, which includes Whitfield, Murray, Pickens, and Gordon counties. I'm a juvenile probation officer for 30 years, worked for Department of Juvenile Justice for 30 years, and I've always said that the word posterity has always driven me and what we're doing for the sake of our posterity. And so that's what I continue to do here. And now serving as chairman of Education, Youth, and Senate, I just continue to chase that word.
Thank you. Senator Tillery, can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we got you.
Blake Tillery. I represent the 19th district down in Southeast Georgia, 11 counties.
Blake, I promise we won't ask you many questions because you're breaking up on us, buddy. Yeah. Senator Orrock wants to know how your broadband's working out. But I appreciate you listening in. Okay, I'm going to go down here.
That's funny. Dan, I owe you one.
I'm going to go to you at the end down there so people know who these other people are sitting at the table up here.
Williams. I'm interim director of the Senate Research Office, and I'm helping staff this one study committee. That's going to be great work.
Thank you, Haley.
Michael Walker, Deputy Legislative Counsel. I handle K-12 education issues for our office, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And again, I'm Mike Dugan. As you've heard several people, I'm the son of 2 teachers, the brother of a teacher. I have 5 school districts in my district, and a very, very close relationship with the superintendents and the boards of all of those school districts. And kind of like what you've heard before, I love being the #1 state to do business. And as I told the Board of Education a little while back, I also want to be the #1 state for education. And that's that's one of the biggest things that we can do to improve the quality of life in the state of Georgia, is improve the educational opportunities for the students coming forward. So again, thank y'all for being here. So you had an agenda in front of you, and for those of you that know QBE inside and out, we have 1 chair for you up here because you're going to be the only person in the room. There's a lot of people that know facets of QBE, and there's a lot of people that until, like me, just a few weeks ago, thought I had a firm grasp on it until I got a detailed deep dive of QBE. And then I realized how much I did not know. So we have the Georgia Department of Education is going to come forward first and do their presentation on QBE. So thank y'all. If you can go up there or you can come here, whatever's more comfortable for you. What if I'm thinking that's more comfortable for you? Okay. And what is that?
Okay. Yeah, it's on. Okay. My name is John Cooper, and thank you for allowing the Georgia Department of Education to staff this committee. We look forward to trying to help you and the state become #1 in education. So I will start off on presentation talking about QBE. So in the early 80s, Georgia had a constitutional challenge to the previous state education funding formula. The previous formula for school funding did not provide equalization of funding. The state Supreme Court ruled that the state did not require equal spending across systems, and the constitutionality was upheld. However, Governor Joe Frank Harris put together a commission to review the formula. The commission created QBE, Quality Basic Education, and it was signed into law in 1985. It was to provide a comprehensive framework for funding a quality education to every student in Georgia.
Hey, John, before you go on, unfortunately, we have some seniors up here on the committee. I'm talking about these other people here.
Okay.
We're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, can you hear me?
There.
Okay,
Yeah, just do that.
there we are.
Thank
Is
you.
that better? Okay. So there are three main components to the QB formula. There are FTEs. These are student segments that are set by the school district in the fall and the spring of each year. There are program weights that identify what segment students are placed in during the school day for instruction. And the second and third components are T&E and health insurance. This is for our teachers and certified staff. So FTEs are submitted each spring and fall by the school districts. Our data collection team scrubs the data for any major changes. For example, if a special education grants come in or counts come in a little bit higher than usual, our data collection teams usually call the district and kind of verify whether or not that's the case. So we mostly look at the districts and we try to find out, are there changes in QB program weights between each year? For QB, we use the FT count for the formula. The FT count is different from the student count. The FT count is the total number of segments reported. The segments are then divided by 6 to get 1 FTE. One student could have several different QB segments for the day. For example, third grade might have 3 segments of grade 1 through 3 and 3 segments of special education, while student counts are just basically the student identification number. In addition to calculating FT submissions, law requires us to use 3 reports and a projection to determine the FT count used for a QB formula. So when reports come in the fall, we use that to fund, to add on to the past 2 reports to get a calculation. Here's an example right here of how the FTs are determined for QB. So the formulas for determining FTs are created to soften any major changes from year to year. If you look at the example here, you'll see that in October 2021, the count was 1578, but the funded FTEs for that year, 1582. During midterms, FTEs are updated to include the most recent fall count. This is because the initial count was based on the previous fall numbers. So if a district's FTE count causes a reduction in their calculated earnings, the earnings are kept to hold the district harmless for the year. This prevents the district from having to adjust lower earnings when the amended budget is signed in March. However, districts are not held harmless in the next year. By law, we must forward fund the state charter schools too, but they're not held harmless to the counts in fall. There have been several changes to the QB formula, but the last major change was in 2000. This is when several categories for QB were created. The creation of these programs allowed the state to instruct our students according to their need. All students are not taught the same. Outside of our regular program weights like kindergarten, grade 1 through 3, grades 4 through 5, the high school segments, and voc ed, there are 12 specialized categories for students with distinctive needs. Within these are 6 special education categories. In addition to the specialized QB programs in special ed, we have remedial, alternative ed, and ESOL. There are also 3 early intervention programs that are assisting to ensure our students go into next grade. The base weight for the QB formula is grade 9 through 12. All other QB weights are more expensive. The weights are heavier for other instructional categories for 2 main reasons: class size and subject specialists. Within the QB formula weights, we have 2 types of funding. There are direct instructional costs, which make up the teacher salaries, and then there's also indirect instructional costs. Direct instructional costs make up 85% of the QB formula weights and earnings. The remaining 15% are funds earned for needs outside of the classroom. Central admin, school administration, facility maintenance. There was a discussion to actually look at categories like technology too in the past. So what does that look like? Here's a detail that we have in our allotment sheets of the weights for direct and indirect funds, which are earned for each program. Direct instructional costs include teachers, subject specialists, counselors, tech specialist salaries, while indirect includes central admin and school admin earnings. So at the bottom of each, I don't know if you can see that, but at the bottom of each of these weights is a dollar amount per FTE. Those are 6 segments for each category. I also like to point out that our base weight is our 9 through 12 high school weight. As I mentioned on the last slide, you'll see the base weight of 9 through 12 here, along with the other weights. 9 through 12 is used for the class size of 23, which is the base teacher salary, and is divided by that to get the amounts, while the middle school weight is 20. You can also see the additional categories funded by ratios for subject specialists here. In addition, here are the 5 categories for our special ed programs. And you can see that they are not funded with aides or parapros, subject specialists, or counselors. Here we have the final 4 QB categories. So in FY16, we're required by law to include counselor funding for the gifted and remedial. In our allotment sheets, we also have the detail of how positions are earned by QB category and indirect positions. However, based on the statewide waiver, districts are not required to maintain these counts. Okay. Other costs. Most districts will earn a superintendent, secretary, an accountant, and a principal per school. State charters do not earn this because they do not have a superintendent. In central admin, you can see how we calculate the district's earning based on FTE size. A district that is under 5,000 FTEs will earn two assistant superintendents, two superintendents, while a district with over 10,000 will earn 6 assistant superintendents. So, local 5 mil share. 30 years ago, local taxes paid for majority of the district's earnings. So over 12 billion appropriate funds through the QB program. Districts are required to levy 5 mills. Districts can levy up to 20 mills without a voter approval. Local 5 mil share is a state and local partnership that equates to 5 mills. It measures local systems' ability to generate local revenues. So local 5 mil share is also the amount that each local school system shall be required to spend for each fiscal year to participate in the QBE program. The restrictions on local 5 mil share are that it's set statewide, no greater than 20%. And if it goes over 20%, we are required to proportionally make it lower it down to 20%. So the equation is 40% of a district's equalized adjusted property tax minus the exemptions, which are agriculture, homestead, veterans, and you multiply that times 5 mills. By law, only 40% of the value of the property is taxable. So each county is responsible for calculating the assessed value of each property. Unlike equalization, the local 5 mil share only looks at the property tax as part of revenue raising. The second component of QB is health insurance. In FY14, the QB formula changed health insurance from an 18.53% rate to a per member per month, right? $945 a month. This is approximately $11,340 a year. Funding for the state has become has basically been consistent with that, about $1.2 million a year in health insurance for teachers. T&E off the state salary scale is earned. Basically, what happens is districts submit a report detailing where their certified staff are on the state salary scale by their level of education, years of experience. So T&E is used in calculating for startup charters also, but the startup charters basically are supposed to earn at least half of what the district earns. So how is T calculated? Well, when districts submit the reports to us on their certified staff, as you can see, I think it's a little too small there, but but I'll just talk it out. The base teacher's salary is $39,092. So if a teacher is on a T7 with a PhD level with 15 or 16 years experience, they earn a little over 72,000. So the earnings for that teacher for the school district is basically taking where the teacher falls and subtracting it from the base teacher's salary. So the school district would earn around $40,000 for that teacher. So those are the basics and high level at QBE. You have any questions?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, John, for the presentation. Now, the 39,000, that does include the $5,000 pay raise that was passed through.
It actually includes the $2,000 pay raise to the base teacher salary. So last year it was 37,092. So the governor increased the pay raise to or the base teacher salary to 39,000.
So where's the $3,000? The $3,000 is not included in there.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah, 2 years ago. So we had 5,000 total. So
That's
the
right.
governor put in 3,000 from 34 to 37, a couple, and I think it
Okay,
was
so-
FY 820.
Okay.
And then he completed the other 2,000 last year for this year.
So have we done any studies about what the market share is for teacher salaries versus other professional salaries and how all that plays in? Because that's obviously something one of my big concerns going forward and right now is teacher shortage.
Right.
And we're seeing more teachers getting out of education. I know that's why we're here today. And for the next couple of times, we got more teachers getting out of education than we have coming in education. Also, as a part of all this, we all know that the price of education is more. So we probably got more student debt involved. So, I think we need to take a closer look at those numbers. And I think we have to take a closer look at it. And as Senator Duncan said a while ago, so eloquently said, I 1,000% agree with. We need to be the #1 state for education. We need to be the #1 state for literacy. And that's what we say. Okay, thank you.
I agree.
Thank you, man.
I agree.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the presentation, and it is an enormous amount of information to absorb. Very complex. All of this formula approach. I had a specific question as you were running through. You said the health insurance and what it was prior, and then what it is current, and when it changed. Could you walk us through that again? For you had a slide on it.
Yes. So before we had a rate that we applied to the base teacher salary. It was an 18.53% rate for health insurance. That was what we used all up until FY14. So in FY14, we got the actual amount. What are we looking at, and how many certified staff are on health insurance? So we got a count, and we not increased, but we actually calculated at $945 a month per member per month. And that was so a district would earn $11,340 a year for a certified staff that is on health insurance.
Just to follow up on that, so that was FY14 that was switched from a percentage to a flat rate.
Yes.
Per month,
Yes.
and that has not changed since then.
Right. Right.
And yet health insurance costs have gone up since then.
I'm not sure about, that's something that I'm not aware of about the health insurance, but that's what we are actually paying out to school districts.
And it's capped, so to speak. It's
Yes.
capped. It doesn't matter what the market is.
Right.
For health insurance.
Correct.
Public.
Correct.
Thank you.
I've got a question, Senator Dugan, if y'all can hear me.
Go ahead, Senator.
Am I clear enough? Thank you for your presentation. The question that Senator Orrock just asked about health insurance, since the state runs it through the state health benefit plan, would it not be true if we just held that insurance dollar the same, that we would simply just subsidize it with state employees?
You know, considering that question's coming from the appropriations chair, I'm gonna assume that you know of which you speak.
I think that's the way we handle it, is that we actually subsidize the cost of teachers greatly with employees. So that'll be more, and I'll work on something to show the committee members so they can understand that. So we have a good picture.
Good. Good. Thank you. Is there anything else? Senator
No,
Payne?
sir. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your presentation. A few days ago, I was going through some of this and looking at the 18 instructional programs. And I have a pretty good sense about each of these, but could you kind of go and explain what alternative education is?
So I can allow you to go into detail of that, but the difference I can tell you about the FTEs, it's a little different there. It's a little more expensive program, but we districts do not turn any FTE counts for that. We actually take 2.5% of their middle school FTEs and their high school FTEs and voc ed. And that's how we calculate the alt ed. So that's one of the areas that we do not get through data collections for the school districts.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I just got a couple of quick questions for you. You said 2002 was the last significant change in QBE. I'm thinking that technology in the schools probably wasn't the same in 2002 as it is now.
Right.
Does the formula taken that into account at all?
The last, I think it was the 2012 study commission, they included in the materials, it was technology materials, that it could be included in that count. So that was included in the earnings for districts in the weights.
Okay. I think I have a 2012 cell phone. It's a step above flip. So I appreciate that. The one thing, and bless your heart, y'all tried to school me on this like 3 times now, and I learned something new every time you talk. If a district decides to do over 20 mil share, you proportionally lower it down. Explain that to me again.
Local 5 mil share, you're talking about the calculation for local 5 mil share.
You said there was a max of 20 mil without voter approval. Let's say that education is so important to a district that they put it on a ballot and they say, let's take it to 22% or 22 mil. You said something about they lower it from there?
So we were talking about the 20% cap.
Okay.
So what we do at the 20% cap is the total amount for the state. So it's not individual. So an individual district can have a percentage of 21 or 22, but statewide, it has to be 20%. That's what we actually had to do 2 years ago, where we had to lower the cap. I mean, the amount for local 5 mil share.
I'm not talking
When it was
about
over.
local 5 mil share. I'm talking about, isn't the 20 mil cap that's the statutory limit. It was my understanding at one time, and I think there were 8 or 9 districts in the state, and I can't tell you who they were, but they opted to go to a 25 mil share. But I think there was a window on that closed with time. Now I may be all wrong about that, but I believe that's correct.
Okay.
I think there's a 20 mil, it's a statutory cap. I don't think you can raise that millage rate by a local referendum, because I think you had to I think the decision had to be made at that time that if you were going to go to opt for a 25 mil cap, but I think there was a time window that closed. I don't think that cap cannot be raised. I don't think without statutory approval from the legislature. I believe that's right.
Okay. That'd be something worth checking into, because I don't know one way or another. I trust you. So. Okay. Teacher salaries. I'm assuming that there are some districts that augment those salaries. Is that true?
So are you talking about the teacher salary schedule? or-
I looked at the schedule.
Yeah. So that is used for QBE funding. So most districts will have their own teacher salary schedules. So
Do we know what those averages are for, let's say, a teacher 1 to 5 years without the master's entry level position?
we can
You
find
know-
that out.
Okay,
Yeah, we can put that.
so that goes with and Senator Orrock took my question on the insurance rates that thankfully Senator Tillery weighed in on there. So thank you. Any other questions? Number 9.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The presentation is based mainly on Title 20 data. Is that right?
Yes.
And that doesn't really reflect the majority of schools with respect to things like direct instructional costs, does it?
No.
What percentage of schools are not Title 20?
Yeah.
They all fall under.
They all fall under the what? Yeah, I know we're all trying to exchange information here on the mic and off the mic, so
Right.
feel free.
What you might be talking about flexibility concept for all of our school systems. They're either a sort of system or strategic waiver system where they can waive the cost of private employment.
Right.
All but 2 of our school systems fall under that.
All but 2 fall under the Title 20 as opposed to under the,
All but 2 fall under flexibility waivers from private employment.
oh,
So all of them can waive various parts of Title 20, except 2 school districts cannot waive any part. But they've not opted into either become sort of system or strategic waiver.
and where in this process are we looking at comparing our teacher salaries and compensation and packages with where do we rank nationwide?
It's just
What they're, yeah, I think that's probably
something.
we have studies of it for sure, but.
Yeah, and that's,
Yes.
and I appreciate the question, but if we're going to look at salaries, we got to look at the cost of living in every community across the state and look at the, if we compare the salaries of a teacher across Georgia to the salaries of a teacher in New York City, then I want to know the grocery price, the coffee price, the gas price, the apartment price, and everything else that goes along with that. So I think a more equitable comparison would be the cost of salaries across comparable demographics, which would be in the Southeast, would be a good start to look at, because you can get a skewed measure pretty quickly if you just look at it from a national perspective. Anything else, Senator?
John, just one other quick question. The weights, and of course, these weights look like something that 3 MIT graduates came together with. Yeah, it's not anything. Yeah, I don't think Georgia Tech people can do either. Is that anything that's been looked at in those, whether those, and I don't understand this enough to know how the weights really play into it, how the weights will sign up. Have we looked at changing the weights or amending the weights or anything like that?
There are couple study committees that actually looked at the weight changes and combining some of the things, but some of the things that we have done in the past, like we combined middle grades in middle school to all the FTs would basically be in middle school. There were discussions on poverty weights, but nothing's happened since then.
The other thing, Mr. Chairman, I know of one school system not in my district, but in our area that has really gone out and said, we're going to identify and bring in the best teachers, and we're going to pay the best teachers to bring them in. So instead of, they're not doing the 39,000, they're doing some bumps on that because they're looking at it more as an investment in the community rather than just having schools. Thank you.
Senator.
I would ask that you prepare a data sheet for us on a spreadsheet basis by district. The total operating budget for each district, the number of students they have, the average they're spending per student, the amount of that that's funded by state allocation, and the amount of it that's funded by local contribution as a percentage of the total. I'd also ask it by district, going back to the chair, majority leader's question, just list what the starting salary for a beginning teacher is in each district. So you can see on the same line how much more they're paying compared to what the state's funding. And you can also see then the percentage, because you'll find that about 88 or 89% of education funding across the board in the state is for payroll of some sort in the district. It's about 11 to 12% on average. It's usually paid for everything else, but the vast majority of education funding is salaries. And so the majority of the local effort is put out is for salary supplementation. Not only salary supplementation, but also paying for additional teachers that the state does not fund. I know at one time Cobb County had about 400 teachers that they were funding that were not reimbursed from the county. Part of the reason for that was to reduce class size. Part of it was to put parapros in schools that were not paid for. So you have a lot of expenditures for teachers in the state that you don't get a dime for the teacher, because it's all based on the teachers are allocated on a full 6-period day.
Yes.
And another thing that's going to be hard to understand if you haven't looked at it is the fact that schools that are on block scheduling, they have an alternative formula on calculation of allocation of funding for teachers. On a traditional 6-period day, if you say you have a student that has on a traditional 6-period day, if you have study hall, that student may not earn actually but 5 countable sections in that day. So unless things have changed, I don't think they're paying for study hall and the funding formula. And the FTE, and I don't think this was covered. I mean, you could see it, but it's the full-time equivalent. So the number of students, actual number of students that we're paying for is a lot less than what our total enrollment is. Because that's a full six full period counts for one student. And so the enrollment and full-time equivalency, there's going to be a difference in those numbers.
Yes.
But the best, I think the truest comparison is to do the spreadsheet. Look at the districts, look at the total budget, look at percentage state pays, local effort, and see the vast variation with the beginning teachers of what they're paying. And that'll tell you a whole lot about the cost of living on each one of the counties. And there's a huge difference. And part of that has to do with the wealth per student in the district and what they can pay. If you look at some of the districts in the state, some of them are paying maybe their average expenditure per student may be 60% more than what it is in other districts. It's pretty eye-opening when you look at it on district by district. And you can, if you get it on a spreadsheet, you can also get it where you can rank it from lowest to highest or highest to lowest. And it'll give us, from our standpoint on the analysis, this will give us a world of information if we look at that. And really, I think to do an adequate evaluation, that's where it's going to have to start.
So what I'm getting from that is we may not be able to solve this afternoon. Okay. Okay.
If you do, you'll have a great job as a consultant.
Yeah. One thing that you said a second ago, the poverty weights, you mentioned it as a potential. Tell me what you're thinking on that.
That can be looked at. That can be looked at. We're looking at what other states are doing, and we'll have that information for you. And we are looking at other states that have that poverty weight in their calculations.
Yeah, I mean, and that jumped out at me because I'm looking to kind of tag on with what Chairman Tippett was talking about here a second ago. You know, if you're looking at median income across school districts across the state, I would almost put that next to the median income of the county of non-teachers in those same areas to see where they're falling out. That's not on you. That's on us. Because you've got 180 school districts. And you got 159 counties. So you obviously got to factor the city ones in there as well. But if I'm teaching at St. George School in Charlton County, down on the very little tip, and I'm making what you're telling me they're making, I'm probably making over the median income of that area. If I'm in APS, I'm in that 5 years or less, I may not be. So I want to see it weighted a little bit as well. And you get us the 180 school districts, we'll do the rest of it. That being said, those that are in the poverty level are going to have a lower probability of their community being able to supplement their educational programs significantly, because if most of the students in that area are in a state of poverty, it's probably further reaching than that particular school.
Right.
So I'm interested in see the weighting that you're talking about.
Okay.
One more. Nah, you can speak.
If you want to go ahead and add this to your spreadsheet, and it will help in the discussion. Part of the poverty you're talking about is a function of equalization, and that's the reason we have equalization. If you want to add the equalization numbers back in, that's intended to accomplish that. Also, one thing we haven't talked about is Title I. That's Title I's designed to give additional funding for poverty.
Right.
I know I've had some conversations about adding a poverty weighting, and I think before we even talk about that, we need to look at the different districts, see how the Title I monies are allocated federally, and also how they're allocated by the district.
Right.
Because different districts, I mean, they have flexibility under federal law as to how they're going to do it. One of the parts that complicates earning of Title I, and I think they have changed this, but at one time, if a district was over 60-something%, they were counted 100% free and reduced lunches. Now I think I believe they went 3 or 4 years ago to direct certification, and we need to check that,
Yes.
which is certification of actual poverty. I can't tell you right now how that goes, but if you're going to talk about poverty weighting, you need to look at that truly from a standpoint of direct certification and know how many students in the district are truly poverty rather than having 100% poverty because you've reached the 60% free and reduced lunch. We're going to have to look at Title I funding on that. You also need to look at sparsity grants, which are paid by the state, which are going to some of the smallest districts that we have. So there's an awful lot of areas to look at. And because there's a lot of areas to look at, I was talking with majority leader about it. QBE is difficult to understand, but you have so many different varying conditions in the state of Georgia. I don't think a simple formula is going to fairly address the vast differences in needs throughout the state. Now, I'm not saying that QBE does not need to be looked at. The weights don't need to be, I'm not saying they don't need to be looked at. Maybe they need to be adjusted. But I don't think a cutting of the pie where everybody gets the same size piece, that's not going to work in the state of Georgia. There's a reason QBE is complicated, because education in Georgia is complicated, and it will continue to be.
Okay, good.
I'm done.
Well, that was a good question. You can ask another one later on.
No,
Any other questions? Y'all good? Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your time. Y'all coming in to do your testimony here. Next up, Southern Regional Education Board, Dr. Pruitt. And I'm going to
okay. Dr. Pruitt, tell us about yourself, SREB, the function of SREB, and then your findings. I appreciate the job you're doing there. And the service that y'all render was 13 states,
16.
16 states in SREB. And anyway, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you all for letting us come. About me, I'm born and bred Georgia, was here for all but 10 years of my life, and was able to come back 4 years ago as president of Southern Regional Education Board. I served at the Georgia Department of Education, I'm state superintendent in Kentucky, and most importantly, I was a high school science teacher for 12 years. So I've had both on the receiving end of the QBE formula and on the end of administering it. SREB is a regional or is a interstate compact. For those of you who don't know what that means, basically we are in the state law in all 16 of our states, and we are actually celebrating our 75th year. We were actually constituted in 1948 for the purpose of supporting education or to build the economy through education. There was a little commission in 47 that declared the South the biggest economic liability in the country, and the governors and legislators at that time decided there needed somebody to convene them to start helping to plan ways forward. So we get to do that. We literally exist to support you. So we're always thrilled when we're asked to come and speak about things. When it comes to this, I've had a saying for a long time that education isn't rocket science, because rocket science is actually easier. And I'd say when it comes to school finance, that is an understatement. When I was in Kentucky, we kind of had a joke, and I think we actually said it in Georgia some too, that there's only probably about 3 people that really understand the entire formula, and they were the original definition of the designated survivors. We wouldn't let those 3 people ride in the same car. They all had to take separate cars because it's very difficult. It's very complex, and for good reason. I will share with you, and I'll share with Senator Duncan later too. I know that he made the comment about teacher compensation, comparing it across the South. We actually have a compensation dashboard on our website that we keep up to date year to year, that you can actually compare salary schedule, health benefits cost, retirement costs, and take-home pay for first, 15th, and 35-year teachers. So if you wanted to see where Georgia stacks up, and I'm happy to send you the link to that, but you can actually look at, like I said, what is actually on the salary schedule, but you can also see what they actually bring home. So we're happy to share that if you'd like. So what I am here to do is to share a little bit about what's going on in the South, and just to help talk about some of the things that we've seen in the South that have been making changes toward their oh, there we go. Went too fast. Some changes that have happened in different states with regard to their funding formulas. Some things that I would just ask that you keep in your mind as you go through this is, first of all, it's always important to think about what your goals are. If it's really easy to start getting in there and playing with the formulas, it's a different thing to talk about what you want it to be. I mean, for any math teachers in the room, I'm going to apologize up front for what I'm about to say, because it could very well offend you. I don't mean for it to. But, to me, tweaking the formula without thinking about what your goals are ahead of time is sort of like having kids do the even numbers at the end of the chapter in math class. Because you might not learn how to look up the answers in the back of the book, or, but you're not really addressing the issue of how to deal with the instruction. You've got to think about the fact that any change results in winners and losers. And how you do that means that you've got to think through transition to see how you can mitigate as much of that as possible. And of course, there's always unintended consequences. When I was state superintendent, I had a whole committee that was just called the Unintended Consequence Committee. And I would come in and I'd say, all right, here's what we want to do. Tell me everything that you think could go wrong. And they did. I had the most vocal superintendents in the state do that. And sometimes that was not the most pleasant meeting I ever attended. So just for for context and how we think about funding comparisons across the states, we tend to think about them in different categories. First, there's what we would call base formulas. And base formulas, which mainly occur in Alabama, Delaware, and West Virginia, this is where the cost is based, it's based on the cost of resources like salaries, materials, that sort of thing. But when you look at a student-based formula, you tend to look at more how the base student cost, which tends to not include weight, is addressed across the different populations. So for instance, Kentucky, the way we actually developed our budget on this every year was we would give a projection of how many students we would have. There would be a legislative debate about how much money you're going to put in, and they would say, and I'm throwing this number out there, $4,000. And then they would take that, multiply that by the total. And that was what their starting budget discussion was. There's also states that deal with a hybrid formula that tends to, oh, and I didn't mention in the previous one, Tennessee is highlighted in the student-based, although it has not started yet. They just revised their new formula last year. I'll talk about them a little bit more in a moment, but it doesn't actually implement until next year. With hybrid, Georgia, we would consider a hybrid. Now, let me say this too, because I know my colleagues at ECS are coming in a little bit. We may all categorize these a little differently. This is just how we do it at SREB. So we think about a hybrid as having a base cost plus additional program allocation. So there are different models. We think about foundation models where there's a per student guarantee in state and district funding. There's a tiered funding where there's actually a program plus equalization. So one thing that was really tough in Kentucky, and I think if I remember right from my time in Georgia too, people get real confused about what that base dollar is and why some districts get more than others. So in Kentucky, one of the issues was we would say use $4,000, and there would be an assumption every district gets $4,000. Well, no, that was what the money or the number came from. But Jefferson County, where Louisville sits, which is the biggest district in the state, they would, because they have a high tax base, they would actually get significantly less than the $4,000 per student. Whereas Robertson County, who didn't have any industry in their area, and so any type of property tax was a strain on their citizenry, they would get more than the $4,000. So that's how we consider tiered funding. Flat grant is really only one state in our region, and that's North Carolina. This is they've been having some discussions about changing this. In fact, there was a ruling that occurred back in the late 90s that they were not actually fulfilling their constitutional obligation. And they have been working on that ever since. There's actually an 8-year remediation plan at the State Board of Education at this moment where they're thinking through how would that actually transition. Weight factors are in a lot of our different states. There's usually a low income factor in the states that you see there. There's a formula weight for district poverty. In these states, there are specific weighting factors for students with disabilities. In our selected or with district tax effort, obviously that you can see where all those are. Again, that always makes any kind of funding kind of interesting. Having lived in Georgia and in Kentucky, I won't give you my opinion on which one's better, but I will tell you that there are some complications when you're having to deal with two different taxing authorities. Small districts, there are states that specifically have weights for smaller districts that have fewer students and obviously lower tax base. Tennessee in particular it's one of the changes that they have enacted. So that's kind of how we think about the categories here. But what I want to spend a little bit of time on is we've seen 3 states that have significantly shifted their formulas over the last couple of years. And it was one of the things that I know we were asked to talk a little bit more deeply about. So we're going to start in Texas. In Texas, They formed the Commission on Public School Finance back in 2017, 2018. The final report was administered in December of 18. It started going through the political process at that point and turned into House Bill 3, which was approved in 2019. The thing that I would start with here is when the commission was derived, they specifically set forth goals of what this commission was to do. So they defined the purpose of the finance system, the relationship of state and local funding. They determined appropriate levels of local funding within constitutional requirements. They recommended changes reflecting the demographic changes in geographic diversity. So before they ever put pen to paper, they sat down and thought, what do we want this to do in terms of our investment for the state? The changes that they wrought were that they lowered property tax and they implemented limited increases. They had local wealth, less weight in calculations. They increased state funding to economically disadvantaged. They increased transportation, dual credit, and work-based learning. I will just say as a personal aside, having dealt especially with those last three, when it comes to transportation, I honestly don't remember everything about transportation in Georgia. I know how hard it was in Kentucky when we would have a single bus that would do 10,000 miles a day because they had to actually travel through the hollers in the mountains. And transportation tended to be a very difficult thing for districts, especially with rising gas costs. Dual credit is obviously something that Georgia believes heavily in, and it's something to think about how that is impacted. But work-based learning is something I would particularly like to point out. I've presented before another Senate committee last summer about where we're headed in the workforce, and work-based learning is something the industry is telling us more and more that they need. They need people who have had some experience. I know, having a daughter who graduated from college last spring and had difficulty finding a job right out of college because everybody wanted at least 3 years of experience after school. It was a challenge. So that would be something I would encourage you to consider. They also added a new allotment for fast growing districts. So there was a really deliberate attention paid to the fact that some of their districts grow faster than others. And they also required full day pre-K, which was a pretty big change in Texas. They also increased the statewide minimum teacher salary. The minimum percentage of year over year per student increased. Teacher incentive funding, possibly for teachers to earn six-figure salaries, and statewide teacher mentoring program with dedicated funding. I will tell you, I know that one of the comments made earlier was around teacher recruitment and retention. This is a big area of focus at SREB. And one of the things that we have found is that while, of course, salary and compensation are a huge driver to recruitment and retention, there are two things about that. Number one, it's about compensation overall, not just salary. So it's also about health benefits and retirement. But the other part of it is a lot, especially our teachers in their first 5 years, what they're saying they're leaving for is less about the money and more about feeling prepared to be in a classroom. So actually having a teacher mentor program, we had that in Kentucky as well. And we saw a significant retention of those students or those teachers that stayed in that program because I remember what it was like. I walked into Sandy Creek High School on my first day and they gave me the keys, and I was so proud. I walked down the hall. It's like, I'm a teacher, Then I walked down there, got through pre-planning, the bell rang and the kids came in. I went, oh my gosh, I am a teacher and I am by myself. And so that was a pretty big deal in Texas. In Maryland, and I would say that Maryland is probably one of the more stark examples in the country of change. I keep using Kentucky examples and I apologize for that, but most of you probably are aware of the Kentucky Education Reform Act that happened back in the late 90s that completely overhauled the education system. Maryland actually just did that with the Kirwan Commission. I'm going to share with you their funding, but actually you're going to see that this is actually much larger than just their funding. It was a very long process. It actually began back in 2016. And in starting back in 2016, it took them about, it took them 3 years to get the Kerwin Commission report ready. And then it took them another year to get it through legislation. And so finally, another 2 years. So in 2021, it finally passed. And you'll notice a little trend here. The Kerwin Commission set out real clear purposes of what they wanted to do. They wanted to review and recommend needed changes to update the education funding formula and make policy recommendations that enable Maryland's pre-K-12 system to perform at the level of the best performing school systems in the world. So they set that as their goal to begin with. In doing so, they identified big policy buckets. So these were areas around early support and interventions for young children and their families, high quality, diverse teachers and school leaders, including elevating the teaching profession comparable to other fields of education in the same field. Policy area 3 was around college and career readiness standard set at a level required to virtually guarantee success in the first year of any community college program or four-year program. Policy area 4 was to provide additional resources, supports, and services for students who need them to achieve the CCR standard, which included English language learners, students with disabilities, and students from low-income families. And their 5th was a strong accountability system with the authority to hold all entities accountable for implementing the blueprint for Maryland's future. So they completely went through a huge revamp here and basically determined a new funding formula that in each of those areas provided very clear connections to those buckets. So for instance, there's a guaranteed tax rate. There is a per pupil weight for different services that are needed for each student. So they kind of went, in fact, if you think about it, maybe I should have done Maryland last, but there's actually a spectrum here. Texas made significant change. I would say Maryland probably was on the other end of the spectrum where, yes, it is big change, but it also was a bigger scope change than just the formula. The last state that I'll discuss briefly is Tennessee. Tennessee just revamped theirs. They have, again, a lot of thought went into this, a lot of time. They started doing public hearings in 2021. The governor and the state superintendent there were very focused on doing this and doing it quickly, but also recognizing they needed a lot of input from the field. So they proposed this in January of 22. The Student Achievement Act was released in late February of 22, and then the General Assembly actually approved it in April of 22 with Governor Lee signing it the next month. Here's a interesting pattern. They set forth goals before they made a whole lot of tweaks. They wanted to incentivize strategic and efficient expenditures to accelerate student achievement. They wanted to support all students individually. So this was a move to student-based funding as opposed to school-based or resource-based. And they wanted to have a sustainable, flexible, and outcomes-based or outcomes-driven formula. And they wanted to try to achieve as much simplicity and ease of understanding as possible. Now, again, it's a funding formula. This is not something you can stand in line at Walmart and explain to somebody behind you, okay? But this was a specific goal for them. So they transitioned from resource-based funding to a student-based funding. You can see there's a pyramid here where they do base funding, they look at weights, then there's direct funding to districts and schools, and then there's outcomes funding. So there are opportunities for districts to earn more, but they're still meeting their constitutional requirements ahead of time. Their base funding is based on salaries, technology, support services, health services, response to intervention, and instruction. Their weights are poverty, concentrated poverty, small sparse districts, unique learning needs, and charter schools. Their direct funding supports tutoring, literacy support, CTE supports, career and technical education. I assume everybody knows that, but and actually I should say CTAE, remembering I'm in Georgia. And so my apologies to my ag friends out there, but fast growing enrollment growth and district support. I will share also that Tennessee has shown some pretty interesting gains. I think they're at this point, I would call them interesting more so than confirming that their direct tutoring during the summer after COVID did seem to have a great support for their students being able to achieve and to try to overcome some of the learning loss that occurred during COVID. The outcomes-based funding is a per student bonus to districts for academic improvement, industry credential attainment, additional funding for economically disadvantaged students. If I could just share with you my perspective quickly, Georgia has the data system to be able to do special things when it comes to the items there. I'm not here to propose that you do something with funding about it, but because of your data system here in Georgia, you actually could do some pretty special things to be able to incentivize districts to, for instance, focus on high industry need careers as industry certification. Again, having come from a state most recently where we were able to do some of that stuff, it's pretty special. And you can actually drive your workforce in a way that a lot of states aren't able to do because they don't have their data system in place. Now, I will just share with you one more brief thing, and then I'm happy to take any questions or to take my seat, whichever you would prefer. With any, I'm going back here to my original thing with considerations. With any change, you've got to think about the issues of winners and losers, because at the end of the day, it's not just about the people you will hear from at the superintendent board level. It's also about the students that may or may not get what they need. So for instance, in Maryland, in their transition, they are fully prepared that in 2030, they are going to need an additional $4 billion, billion with a B, dollar investment just to get the transition through. Now, obviously, at some point that dollar amount would come down, but their issue is they don't want in the interim for districts to not get what they need as they go into that transition. And you would actually see similar things in both Texas and Tennessee, where they are looking specifically at being able to support their districts in a time of transition to make sure that they mitigate as much as possible the issue of winners and losers. So with that, and Senator Duncan, I will say to you again, if you didn't catch this when you came back in, if you want to know about the comparison of Georgia teachers to the other 15 states, we have a teacher compensation dashboard on our website that has salary, health benefit costs, retirement costs, and take-home pay. And I'll be happy to share.
Yeah, I caught that on the way in, and I appreciate it, because when I say we're going to do some research into this, it's basically that lady sitting down at the end of the counter down there is the we that's doing the research on this. So
shoot me an email and we'll be glad to give you all the data we've got.
Okay, before I send it around for questions, you do know about our apprenticeship, statewide apprenticeship program.
I do. Absolutely.
Okay. So that kind of addresses part of what you were talking about in there.
It does.
And I like what you said about Maryland and Tennessee's commission purpose, because I like it because it agrees with what we said we were here right now. So I think that's a good first step. I will say, and I understand completely about winners and losers on this, and we got to be careful with it. I also understand that humans by nature fear change more than they fear failure. And failure in my mind on this is not doing anything when we have the opportunity to improve the quality of education for our students moving forward. We need to be smart about how we do it. But I don't think that anybody on this committee is going to let the possibility of the fear of change get in the way of doing what's best for.
And that's actually what I meant when I said that, is just being thoughtful about what's happening as that transition occurs.
And so I'm thankful that y'all are participating in this, because we're counting on y'all to provide us all the information we can, because I mean, between the two senators right here that have been here for more than a minute, we're figuring this out as we go. And we got a lot of smart people around that have seen some of this before. And we're counting on y'all helping us
Happy to
do it right. But you did say how many miles per day?
10,000 miles a day.
You know, that's from Atlanta to Los Angeles
I
four
do
and a
know
half
that.
times.
I do know that. You got
That's not per bus.
No, I'm sorry. It's 10,000 miles of bus traffic a day. So yeah, I mean, it's significant when because you can't go from point A to point B in the hollers of Eastern Kentucky. You actually have to go all the way this way to get around the mountain. So
yeah, I was going to give my good friend, Leader Thayer a text after this and say,
10,000 of school bus miles a day, not per school bus.
okay,
Yeah, sorry.
thank you.
Although feel free to give Senator Thayer a text and tell him I said hello.
Okay, we'll do. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to start seniority.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. So good to be with you again and to do your presentation. Enjoyed our time together at NCSL.
So did I.
Just a few weeks back. Does the dashboard that you described compare teacher salaries to their counterparts, that is others with college education that are not teachers?
So it does that. What we use is something called the teacher penalty, which is actually a comparison between the teacher and other people in their similar educations. But it's and to be fair, that's one of those things that can be a little subjective, but that's the only measure we really have to do that. But the dashboard itself is pretty much focused on the comparison of teachers in their first, 15th, and 35th year to other states. So the dashboard itself is that, but we do also have reports on the comparison to other professions.
That would be interesting to share with us.
Sure.
And do you have is there a takeaway on where we rank, just comparing teacher salaries across the 13 states that SREB works with?
So from a salary standpoint, y'all are in pretty good shape. I mean, it's certainly the governor and you guys providing that big pay raise over the last couple of years moved Georgia up significantly, and kudos for that. And I apologize. I should have looked at it before I came in here. The one thing I do remember is that healthcare is in the second highest quartile of charge to teachers in Georgia. So that means you're in the second four because there are 16 states. And your take home pay is in the highest quartile, I think, but I need to go back and double check that. Perfect. I'm sorry. And that's for year 15. I don't remember. If I remember right, it gets better as you go. Those early years are a little bit tougher, but year 15, I'm 99% sure that I remember you guys are, I can't say you guys anymore. I'm back in Georgia, that we are in the highest quartile take home pay.
And just one other question. There's several states that are addressing, that include in their formula, addressing the poverty level of students. And it's my firm conviction that kids from that background and with that poverty status really have a better shot at succeeding if there are more services funded and provided for them. I certainly hear that from pre-K when they had the outreach person to connect with the families and keep them connected to the process. The students were more supported by their families. The families were incorporated in a kind of a holistic approach to the family situation. So how does Georgia? I believe Georgia compares very poorly with other states around addressing poverty as one of the measures.
Well, I don't know that I could speak to whether it's better or worse than the others, but I will tell you all of them struggle with it. There are I think it's one of the reasons why you saw in Texas and Tennessee in particular, there was a particular interest in that. When you look at, especially, for instance, Eastern Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, where the poverty level is, you don't just have poverty level, you have multi-generational unemployment. And so a critical need is working with families in those environments so that they can see the benefit of further education. I mean, I personally met a gentleman who got a full scholarship to college, room, board, books, everything. And his dad said, you can either have a college degree or you can have a family, but you can't have both. And there needed to be more work done in the family there to help them understand that that would not cause them to look down or to separate from the family. Actually, it's a way to help the family economically. So I think that there's a place there where working with families, working with communities is really important.
And most states have something of, along that line
Mhm.
that we don't have.
I don't know that I'd say all of them have something. They may all claim to. There are going to be some that are going to be more explicit than others.
Sure.
You know, and again, when looking at especially Texas and in Maryland too, and the three of those were very explicit allocations that they were choosing to make towards low income students and families. So it's not just an allocation. I mean, it'll be an allocation that goes to the district or in school, but it's going to have a little bit of here's what you do with that money type thing.
Direction. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
Senator.
ma'am.
Senator, I'm glad we're legislative branch and not judicial, because that was leading the witness there a little bit.
I've never seen that happen.
No, never at all. Senator Hickman.
Thank you, sir. Couple quick questions. You mentioned a word that I like a lot. It's called mentoring. And you said that happened in Kentucky, and we've been talking a good bit about it in our district. And tell me how, and I've been talking to a good bit of superintendents about it. Tell me how that worked in Kentucky. Our big concern is you already got teachers that are full-time, so you really don't have teachers that can be full-time and be mentors. So how'd y'all do it up there?
So actually, there were two programs there in Kentucky that we used. One was called K-TIP, and that was a requirement of all brand new teachers. And they did actually use teachers in the building as mentors for that. Now, they gave them an extra release period, and I don't remember this exactly, but I want to say there was usually, depending on the district, a little bit of a supplement for that teacher to do some extra work there. And there were certain requirements of things that they had to go through, number of times that they had to meet, the types of conversations they were have, the documentation that was needing to be there. And so it was a pretty impactful program. Unfortunately, when we had some severe budget cuts a few years ago, that went by the wayside, but as a testament of how effective it was, a lot of the districts kept doing it, even though there was no longer state funding for it. The second part of that is, let me just give full disclosure when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. This is not me doing an SREB commercial, because but it does happen to be us. But when I was state superintendent, I actually brought the Teach to Lead program to our CTAE teachers, which is an SREB program, because I was only having about a 68% retention rate from year to year. You know, a lot of these folks, remember, coming straight from industry. And so they're trying to get their certification. And in the span of 3 years, we went to a 90% retention rate, because what happens is these folks are teaching full time. They have all the content knowledge that you would want. You know, you've got a welder who's been welding for 25 years, and all of a sudden there's 25 kids sitting in front of them, and you're hoping they don't weld their hand to something, right? I mean, you got all the issues. So what Teach to Lead does is it provides a mentor that does a couple of things. Number one, it brings all of them together at one time so they can create what's called a learning community where they can learn from each other and realize they're not by themselves, which is a big part of the mentor program, realizing that you're not alone. But the other part of it is having individual small group mentors that actually give them real-time support. So teachers having trouble with, Johnny sitting in the back of the room, I'm pulling my hair out. What should I do? And the mentor is immediately able to give them supports. So it's a combination of teaching what good pedagogy, what good instructional practice is. It's how do you manage good classrooms? It's somebody that can help me know I'm not by myself. So it's a pretty intensive program, but yet not so intensive that another teacher in the building couldn't actually provide that support. Although, like I said, it usually came with an extra planning period because they kind of needed it and
Well-
often deserved it.
Well, that's great. You know, some of the superintendents I talked to said, wouldn't it be great? And of course, we always want to strive for the ideal. We want to strive for utopia, knowing we not get there, but we want to be somewhere up there close. But wouldn't it be great to have a mentor for each grade, a teacher that was a full-time that could go around and work with each teacher and so forth? My big concern, a lot of this stuff going forward is I want us to see us kind of target down into the classroom and look at the mentoring for teachers. I want us to look at the supplies for classrooms where teachers now having to take a lot of money out of their personal pocketbooks and paper supplies. I want us to look at tutoring, like you said. I want us to look at field trips. We've got to go down in the classroom and do that. And we can do that. The money is there. You know, we're putting in artificial turf football fields. We're putting in artificial turf baseball fields. We're doing all this kind of stuff. And when we do all that stuff, I don't think a lot of our people realize what kind of message that sends to our teachers that we can put all this money in these facilities, but yet we can't put money into the classroom. And we can do it, and we can do it with this, with our committee here. We can work some things out like that.
If I could, one friendly amendment is when you're talking about the mentors is if that's a direction you want to go, I want to encourage you that part of that is training the mentors before you cut them loose. Because I think that one of the things that was very effective in Kentucky, and actually, and Matt will remember this, back in 2005, we had a science mentor program here in Georgia because the high school graduation test scores were so bad. And you guys actually gave the department money to do that. And I was lucky I got to do that program. And we didn't let anybody loose in a classroom for a year. And we did training for a solid year before. And as a result, we went from 68% passing on the first time to 88% passing in 5 years. So, I mean, it was, so that training is actually critical to the mentors. Otherwise, you're going to have one teacher sitting in the room with another teacher. One of them happens to have been teaching longer, but it's different when you're coaching. You know, it's kind of like sometimes some of our greatest pro players didn't exactly become the greatest coaches. And so I would just say, as you're thinking about that, think about the training for those mentors as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Senator.
I'll comment on statement Senator Hickman made. The one thing that is one of the puzzling parts of education funding. You can pay for AstroTurf with SPLOST dollars, but you can't pay for pencils and paper with it. And if you're going to change that, it's going to take a constitutional amendment. But there's been some talk about a split penny on SPLOST, or a split collection, part of it going for supplemental things in the school district and some for capital improvements. I'd say this, so some of our districts are better are better situated right now from a capital asset standpoint than they are an instructional standpoint, because they've had more discretionary funding in capital spending than they've had in instructional dollars. Just an observation.
Yeah, you two talking about
Can I follow up with that comment? Well, thank you, Senator Tibbin. I've done some work on that, and I've done some work in our district with our superintendents and all. And I know that, and that's what really bothers me so much. But I've looked at it, if it would take a constitutional amendment, exactly. But in our district, I said, well, what if we took the East Block? And of course, it'd take a period of time because a lot of this East Blocks is already in place. It's either the process in place or the advertising in place. But what if we took a minimum of 5% of that penny or whatever it is, and a maximum of 15%? And people say, well, why you say a minimum of 5? I said, well, if you say 0, people will do 0. And I said, they said, why you say 15? I said, well, because 20 sounds like too much. But if you took that and you took that 5% and put back into classroom through mentoring, through tutoring, through supplies, through field trips. Okay. In our school district, Bullock County, our superintendent says that's 5% would be $50,000 a month going back into the classroom, $600,000 in our for mentoring, for tutoring, for supplies and all. And I've met with all the 6 superintendents that I represent, and all of them are in favor of it.
Thank you. Okay, I agree with what y'all are talking about. We'll handle East Blast on the next committee meeting. We're gonna focus on QBE on this one. Just one quick question for you: how the millage rate is collected across all the states? Is it all the same?
No, it's a little different, and I can dig into that for you a little bit deeper. It's a little different, and I mean, like in Kentucky, we called them nickels rather than mills. So because it was a nickel for $100, and so it's a little different, and it's you actually kind of have to dig into it a little bit, because there's usually what people will call a mill or a nickel, and then there's what it really kind of is in a deeper sense. We actually have been meeting with the CFOs from all of our states during the pandemic. So we have a pretty good relationship with them, and we'll be happy to give them all a call and find out exactly how that works.
If you would, just
Yeah, absolutely.
You did math a little while ago. I'm doing science. If we're going to do an experiment, I want to make sure the variables are all the same that we're putting into the experiment to make sure the outcome is repeatable.
And as a science guy, I love that you do science. So.
Well, this is where I tell you I'm a history guy. Any other questions here? I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
And what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 3.5-minute break. That's it's not a full nickel, but we're going to take a 3.5-minute break because we're old, and then we'll be back and get started in 25 till. And we have one more presentation to get ready for. So y'all can go out and get ready, and we'll be back in just a minute. Ethan reminded me, I noticed several of y'all taking pictures of the slides. If you take up one of these pamphlets on the end down here, it's got all the links on the computer. I waited till 2 hours into this to tell you that. No, I'm sorry. I thought we mentioned that earlier. That's on me. But at the corner of the table down here, there's some. So since I said that right now, go ahead and come up here and get them. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. All right, so we're going to come back in. Here's the Senator Orrock just mentioned something a second ago. All the meetings are scheduled from 2 to 4 across the state. We're going to look at modifying at least one of those to a little bit later in the day so that active teachers have the opportunity to come in and engage. As I was, who was I talking to? Oh, you. As we were talking about earlier, I do have to balance the safety of the travel of the committee with. So this is not going to be from like 7 to 9. It'll be from like 3 to 5. Okay. But it will still increase the opportunity for those to be able to come in and testify or witness, depends on which denomination you are, to us. So for the next little bit here, the great compromise that we've had is that we're going to have a 2-minute limit for those that are coming to testify, except for Representative Davis. She gets 3 minutes because nobody in the House can say anything in 2 minutes. So we'll give you a little extra time. So, and I'm going to go just straight down the list. Zena M. Zena? Okay, so we're going to hold off on this because we have another presenter online that is ready to go now. Is that we set? Okay.
Hello, Senator. Are we good to start?
We are. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to share my screen and then Ben will get us started.
Good afternoon, Chairman Duncan, members of the committee, and thank you for inviting us to join you today. My name is Ben. I am a State Relations Associate with the Education Commission of the States and liaison to Georgia. Today, we'll be giving a national overview of funding mechanisms, but before Chris gets into that presentation, I wanted to briefly share a little bit about who we are here at ECS and what we do, for those of you who are unfamiliar. ECS is a nonpartisan education policy research group. We are a national interstate compact. We made up of commissioners from every state who are appointed by their respective state governments in various ways. These commissioners include governors, legislators, members of departments of education, higher education institutions, and other organizations. But everyone who touches education policy is our constituent. We encourage our commissioners and constituents to consider us as an extension of your ed policy team. We believe that providing factual, unbiased information of the many different approaches states take leads to better informed decision-making and stronger policies in all 50 states. And we do this in a variety of ways, through research, publishing reports, hosting convenings, and providing counsel. Our policy team reads every piece of education-related legislation, from preschool to post-secondary and workforce development, and provide reports with concise overviews of these policies. We also convene and connect state policy leaders, as well as provide counsel, which can take the form of giving testimony, answering information requests, and providing technical assistance. So with that, I would like to introduce your policy team member today, Chris Duncan. Chris is a senior policy analyst and an expert in many things ed policy, not the least of which is funding mechanisms. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Ben. And Chairman Dugan, can you hear us all right?
You're great. Thank you.
Okay, great, wonderful. So thank you, Chairman Dugan, members of the committee for having us here today. Also, happy birthday, Chairman Dugan. So as Ben mentioned, we're going to be providing a national landscape of some of the education policies that at K-12 funding policies, and touch on briefly some legislative trends we've seen so far in 2020, 2022. But I wanted to start by highlighting some of the high level decisions you all as policymakers have when you're reviewing funding formula, because it is quite the undertaking, particularly with as old a formula as the QBE. So I'm going to start by just going over some of those high level choices that you all have to consider as a potential roadmap for ways that you can engage in reforming your K-12 funding system. So the first is a simple question of how to allocate aid. And Dr. Pruitt touched on this a bit in his presentation about using either allocating resources by student or by staffing position or some combination of the two. The next is how to count students. And this might seem like a simple choice or a simple calculation, but because student counts drive so much of funding allocations, it's really an important one in K-12 funding models. Then is how much base funding to provide. And then once you've determined how much base funding, what the additional supports are providing for students with unique learning needs and districts with special characteristics. And then how to split costs with local government so that, as you all are familiar with the local 5 mil share, that has gotten some discussion here in this committee. And then what you want to fund outside of the formula. Some states will fund transportation, school construction, or certain high cost services outside of the formula through categorical grants or another funding structure. So I'm here today to share some of the ECS resources that can help you navigate these choices and to provide a national landscape. ECS does what's called 50 state comparisons on a variety of different policy issues. Chairman, you also expressed an interest in teacher recruitment and retention. We have a 50 state comparison that I can provide to the committee on teacher recruitment and retention policies. But today I'm going to share what we've collected as part of our K-12 funding and special education funding 50 state comparison. This slide has some of the data that we collect as part of that. And you'll notice that this connects to a lot of those initial questions or initial choices that I shared at the beginning. So we collect information on the primary funding model used by states, the base budget amounts in statute or in budget, how states count students for funding purposes, as well as how states provide additional resources for unique student learning needs and for special school care districts. All of this is available on our website. I will also provide links to the committee so you have all this resources. We have it as an interactive database, so you can kind of click on what's of interest to you and scroll through it. We also have state profiles if you want to focus in on a particular state or if you want to read the summary that we have for Georgia. Recognizing that Dr. Pruitt has already touched on this a little bit, I wanted to go through kind of briefly look at the primary funding model. So that was that first decision point that I shared in the bullets. As I mentioned, that states take different approaches in allocating aid, and this largely comes down to a decision of allocating aid for students or allocating aid for positions or some combination of the two. The most common approach is what's called student-based funding. Under this model, funds are allocated based on student characteristics and their learning needs. We identified that 33 states and DC use this student-based approach. That number will increase to 34 starting in the 23-24 school year, because that is when Tennessee's new funding model, the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement Act, or TISA, will be implemented. There are some student-based models are attractive because they offer some distinct advantages. One is transparency. There is a single dollar amount that is being allocated per student, so that is clear to the public about how much funds are being allocated on a per student basis. Another is equity, because it's easy to adjust that base dollar amount based upon differences of students and what their learning needs are. And the final one is on local autonomy and flexibility, because the state is not specifying specific services or staffing levels for the districts to fund. And so districts have choices in how they want to spend those resources. On the flip side of the coin, some of the challenges would be state financial oversight with this model. States are not telling districts necessarily how to spend all of their resources, and there could be concerns about funds that are going to the district not reaching the schools that have the student populations for which some of the weights have been allocated. To counter that, leaders can improve district reporting on spending. As an example, as part of adopting TISA, Tennessee increased their reporting requirements, and they're going to be publishing spending data at both the district and the school level in the state's annual report card. The other approach is the resource-based approach. And so this is where states are guaranteeing a base level of resources and oftentimes have a set staffing ratios in either their statute or their budget. States will often also provide additional resources for other programmatic costs, include maintenance and operation, textbooks, technologies, among other items. And we identified 10 states that allocate funds using this approach. Positives to this is that the state can ensure that certain programmatic goals are met, such as target class sizes, staffing for desired positions. Chairman, you mentioned an interest or concern about students' access to school counselors or mental health staffing. You can ensure that sufficient resources are provided for those provisions. Some of the challenges: less local autonomy and flexibility, and it's really hard to adjust based on different student characteristics. The other approach that we've seen, and Georgia is included in this category, are states that use a combination of those two. And that means they oftentimes have some types of student weights, but also designated staffing levels for certain positions. For example, in Massachusetts, their Chapter 78 formula multiplies enrollment by 10 different weighted enrollment categories, and then by 11 different cost categories. We saw in the presentation earlier today from the department in Georgia that there's the 18 different categories that are used in calculating the QBE. It's kind of a similar hybrid approach that we see in Massachusetts. Some of the advantages is that it's a way of kind of balancing having state involvement in how resources are spent and staffing levels. And you can also create student weights because they're both factored into the formula. Challenges, as I think a lot of the people who've been studying the QBE and been learning and reading about it, is the complexity and lack of transparency. There's oftentimes a lot of different adjustments that are made. And I mentioned that Massachusetts has those 10 different enrollment categories and 11 different cost categories. So I do want to pause a moment to see if you all have any questions on the base funding model before I dive into student counts.
We're all shaking our head. We're ready to go to the next.
All right, so moving on. So I mentioned that that states have the different funding models, but all these models require districts to count their student population, states to use that to calculate amount of funding that each district receives. And we've at ECS classified 5 different methods used by states. The most popular is using a membership average to calculate the average number of children enrolled in each district for most or all of the school year. By using an average is considered more accurate because the count is based on most or all of the school year rather than a single or a few points in time. And also by using membership, the count is based on the number of students a district must be prepared to instruct rather than the number of students present on any given day. It therefore doesn't penalize districts with lower attendance rates that are oftentimes in higher areas of higher poverty. So that's why we've listed equity as an advantage. However, there is no financial incentive for districts to improve attendance, and so that's one of the challenges. An alternative that some states use is using an attendance average rather than a membership/enrollment average. This approach provides a financial incentive to districts to maintain or improve their attendance because it is directly tied to how much money they receive from the state. This incentive may get districts to focus on student populations that have historically experienced barriers to consistent attendance, which I have listed there. But also it comes with some challenges. On the other side, the approach penalizes districts with lower attendance rates, and districts with attendance challenges may already be under-resourced and having difficulty overcoming barriers to student attendance. So while there is an incentive to increase attendance, the district may not be able to increase attendance, and that will lower the amount of aid they receive from the state. Another concern is stability. Attendance can fluctuate, as we've seen throughout the pandemic. Two of the states that have been using the attendance average, California and Idaho, they transitioned to enrollment during the pandemic because it had created such fluctuation in enrollment amounts. So they did that on a temporary basis, and now they're both looking at doing it on a permanent basis. I've kind of grouped the other methods for time's sake, because it's kind of a similar conversation. So the other methods being a single count, multiple days, or a count period. These approaches are easier to administer, but are less sensitive to fluctuations that occur throughout the school year. So this could be from students transferring from one district to another, students enrolling after the selected count day, or students who drop out of school. Georgia, as was expressed in the presentation earlier from the department, uses 2 count days, one in the fall and the spring, to determine funding amounts. So that is another area that you could potentially look at as a committee. And if you have more interest, sorry, I'm clicking through here. If you have more interest in this topic, UCS published a brief earlier this year discussing in a little bit more in depth the advantages and challenges of each of these approaches, along with a discussion on some of the pressing questions around student counts, such as counting virtual students, students from low-income backgrounds, and holding school districts harmless for enrollment declines. Should I pause? Does anyone have anything they want to ask? I know I'm going through these slides fairly quickly, so I want to make sure that people have an opportunity to ask questions.
I'm going to have some questions when you're done. I'll
Okay.
wait ambushing you at the very end and have them all at one time. So,
Okay, great.
no, and it's really not that. It's just, I prefer not to interrupt your flow. You're doing well here. Anybody else have any questions? No, go ahead.
All right, so states account for differences in student learning needs in districts with unique characteristics as well. And as part of our review, we have identified that all states provide additional funds for special education services in DC. And you might notice these numbers may appear a little bit larger than what Dr. Pruitt presented. I just want to clarify that he was looking at funding weights, and we're looking at funding from any source. So whether that's like a special categorical grant or additional positions that are allocated. So it's a bit more of an inclusive definition than I think what he was presenting on in his presentation, just to kind of clarify if you see any differences. But all states provide additional funds for special education students. Most states provide additional resources for English learners. 44 states and DC provide additional funds for services for our low-income background students. That number is going to increase to 45. Arizona just enacted legislation this year to create an opportunity weight. That's for students eligible for a free or reduced price lunch or an alternative poverty measure. And so they will be another state that will be providing those resources. As part of our review, and if we missed it, we're curious to hear from you all in the department there, but we did not identify the QBE as currently providing additional resources for students from low-income backgrounds. The majority of states also provide funds to districts for gifted and talented programs and to small and rural school districts, including Georgia. So state leaders have many choices in determining how to structure assistance for these programs. In the diagram on the slide, I've outlined some of the decisions for funding supports for low-income students. I'm just going to walk through those quickly. First, the state has to decide if they want to provide these services. And so that's 45 is the 44 states in DC that currently provide it. The next question is, how do you determine eligibility? What students count as low income? Most states use free or reduced price meals. That's the 29 number that's listed there on the slide. But this is becoming a difficult measure for students from low-income backgrounds, given increased participation in the community eligibility provision and universal free meals. So states have started transitioning to using other measures like other eligibility for other federal benefit programs, or some states have developed supplemental income forms that they've sent out to students and families. So once the students are identified, figuring out how you want to allocate those resources, what funding mechanism to use. Most states use either a single weight, that's the 22 number there, or multiple weights, the 13. So this is, as you are familiar with QBE, allocating additional funds that's multiplied by the base aid amount that's distributed to districts. The next question is how much to appropriate. There's really a wide range in the additional funds that are allocated by states to support students from low-income backgrounds. The range we have right there are the range for states that have a single flat weight. So it's an additional $190 per student to an additional more than $7,000 per student. And that $7,000 is for the Maryland's new blueprint formula that we heard from Dr. Pruitt on. Has the largest weight to support students from low-income backgrounds in the country. And then the last item is that some states will vary funding based on concentration of students from low-income backgrounds. We identified 14 states that do that. To quickly highlight the level of variation that exists in those funding weights, I put together this slide. You see that from a single weight, it can vary from just an additional 2.5% to an additional 91%, which is almost double the base amount of funding. States with multiple weights vary greatly as well. Virginia has an additional 1% provided, and they have multiple weights, so that's just their smallest weight, not their largest weight, and to New York's largest weight, which is an additional 200%, which is 3 times the funding base amount of funding. I do want to note that this isn't an apples to apples comparison. New York's group includes other student groups, including EL students. I just wanted to have this to display the range that exists, not to necessarily, perfectly compare one state to another. So I'm going to end by just discussing some of the legislative trends that we've seen so far in our 2022 tracking. Each year, ECS tracks legislation in 40 different issue areas. And so we have a state education policy tracker that is available on our website. And so if there's a certain area, policy issue area of interest, you can go to that policy tracker and select that issue, and you can see what states have proposed legislation and what states have enacted legislation in these different issue areas. In K-12 finance so far, we've identified over 700 proposed bills and 119 enacted or vetoed bills. And we identified kind of 4 trends so far in those enacted or vetoed bills. The first is a shift to more student-centered funding and additional supports for certain student populations. And this was discussed with the Tennessee overhauling their resource-based basic education program with TISA. Another example is Vermont enacted a student equity bill, which makes significant changes to their weighting factors in their formula. They had kind of an extensive multi-year review of their formula to determine what weights they wanted to use. And the new formula will give them some of the largest weights in the country for students from low-income backgrounds and English learners. The other trend has been in teacher pay, increasing teacher pay because of many of the recruitment and retention concerns that has been voiced by members of the committee already in this meeting. We've identified 200 proposed bills and 37 enacted bills making changes to teacher compensation. This is in addition to kind of regularly scheduled changes that happened in formulas as part of just updating the formula. One example is Mississippi. They enacted one of the biggest changes to teacher compensation in their state's history by adopting the Strategically Accelerating the Recruitment and Retention of Teachers Act, the START Act. And so that revises their salary schedule to be providing raises between $4,000 and $6,000 per teacher, and is estimated state investment of approximately $250 million. So a very large state investment for teacher pay. The other trend that we've seen is states increasing staffing for mental health and social and emotional learning services. Early research from the pandemic has suggested that broadly it has increased levels of stress, anxiety, and depression across PK through 12 youth. And some of the most vulnerable students have been particularly affected. So recognizing that, Washington enacted legislation to expand comprehensive student supports. And this increases the state allocation for school nurses, social workers, psychologists, and school counselors. They have a resource-based approach, so they just adjusted the staffing levels that they have in their funding formula. The estimated, once it's phased in over the next biennium, they're estimating that'll cost the state over $500 million. So a really significant investment for the state in this staffing. And then the last trend I wanted to note is with school nutrition. The universal free meals that the federal government had provided throughout the pandemic are expiring this fall as students are returning. And so some states took action in 2021 and some states in 2022 to extend universal free meals for students. In 2022, those states were Colorado, Massachusetts, and Vermont. In order for Colorado to enact it, though, it's actually going to a referendum this November. So they just passed a bill to send it to a referendum. So here are some of the resources that I drew upon, and we'll provide links to you, Senator Dugan, and members of the committee, and really happy to take any questions that you have. And as you're engaging in this work, if there's a really topic area of focus that emerges that we can be a supportive partner in, I'm really happy to provide the resources that we can as you're engaging in this review.
Thank you, Chris. I do have a couple of questions before we turn it over, and I appreciate you and all the organizations that have weighed in today to help us get to where we want to go. And I'm sure y'all all see the solutions exactly the same way. So no, I like the variety concept of having different options of menu items in which we can choose from. First, it's not a question for you. I do want a list of all the funding sources that go to the school systems and what the intent of those funding sources are. What's it for? What are the strings and what are they? Because I think we're just touching on a piece of it right now. I will ask about the attendance average. I got concerns that, and I'm going to put this out on the knowing full well that we're not driving towards solutions today. We're just hearing. I do have concerns with that because some of our more challenging districts are in areas where attendance by the students is already problematic. And if we start cutting funding resources for those, I think you can only compound the problem. So I'm a little hesitant about that one as we move forward. You said something about supplemental forms for low-income backgrounds as a way. Are you familiar with FAFSA at all?
Yeah, so that's for financial aid. Some states for the K-12 school systems have just a supplemental form that it's separate from FAFSA.
My point on that was, I'm sorry to cut you off. It's not about the FAFSA itself. It's those that are most dependent on getting FAFSA at the higher ed are coming from families who have not have that background, that now we're telling them fill out the form to get, and I'm afraid we're doing that with a different form at a lower level. Does that make sense? It's
yeah, it's adding an administrative element, an additional administrative element. And we only identified, I think, 2 or 3 states that have done that. Most states have gone to just using eligibility for other federal benefit programs, a direct certification in TANF, SNAP. Some states include Medicaid, and using that as a way of determining that student amount, since that information is already being collected.
okay. That makes me feel better. I was thinking we were sending a form home with the kid to a parent and saying, fill this out. And if it was like my book bag when I was in school, They would have never seen it. And I do want to brag on the state though for a second, because I've been in the Senate for 10 years and we've passed 5 teacher pay raises within that 10 years. So that I think we truly, I'm going to caveat that, because something you said a little while ago, we send the money to the schools. And when we can't direct how that funding is allocated once it gets to the school system, there are some people that are upset and want us to be more direct. When we start directing exactly how that money is spent in the school system, there are those that want us to take a step back and not be so directive. So that's a fine line we walk. And I think the way we got around that eventually was we changed the pay scale. But regardless, we have passed 5 teacher pay raises in 10 years. So we understand the value and the merit of the educators within the state of Georgia. Any other questions for Chris? Senator Orrock.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. Thanks so much for the work that you all do and the information that you've provided to us today. Have you seen this recent am I not on? Good. I'm dead. Hello? Yeah, did I?
Yes, Senator, I can hear you.
Great. The Economic Policy Institute just released a report on education that indicated really, I was startled by the findings that that teacher pay. We just heard, 5 times in 10 years that there's been pay adjustments here, but teacher pay has fallen behind the cost of living. Have you seen that Economic Policy Institute report that I'm talking about?
Yeah, I have. They calculate teacher wage penalty annually by comparing salaries in states for teachers to a comparative group of private sector employment with people with similar education backgrounds.
Exactly. And the finding was, I don't want to sit here and try to pull it up on my phone, but I'm glad that you've seen it and could speak about it. Maybe it's something we could provide to the whole committee. He's pulling it up.
Yeah, I didn't have what they calculated for Georgia offhand, so I was just trying to pull that number up.
But it's the overall finding is what?
That it's hit a new high. They've calculated this every year, and it's at its highest level. I think since they've done it is what they're sharing in this report.
What is at its highest level?
What they are calling the teacher wage penalty. This is how they compare the average salaries for teachers in states to average salaries of people employed in the private sector with a similar educational background.
And so it's an all-time high in terms of a disparate level. Is that what?
That's what they're calculating. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting their report, because obviously I was not involved in calculating it, but
yeah, I wish I'd had mine. I had it printed out because I just saw it today.
So they identified Georgia having a wage penalty of 26.8%. So teachers making 26.8% less than people employed in the private sector.
That's right. That's what I found that a very stark finding. And we discussed this a bit in the committee prior to convening. The teacher retention rates are part of this part of this picture, and the cost you spend recruiting to fill those slots and to train, to train in the, new members of the teacher workforce. Is very costly. Well, teacher retention is pretty commonplace across the nation. I will ask you that since you all do the comparatives.
Yeah, and I mean, what we've seen is that particularly shortages in specific subject areas has been a persistent challenge, and we have some resources we can provide on that. One of the strategies states have taken is been increased compensation to address that issue. We mentioned that it was a really prevalent trend that we saw in legislative tracking this year. Part of that has been with inflation, a need to compensate teachers to try to keep pace with the increased cost of living. And part of that is states being in decent financial positions so that they can afford to provide pay raises to teachers, recognizing that there are shortages. And this is one of the strategies, one of the tools for trying to increase the number of teachers that are coming to the state.
Are you familiar with any strategies to this whole thing of who is seeking training to be a teacher? Are you familiar? Any kind of breakthrough insights or practices that some states are doing to influence, in other words, to guide high school students into a path of being a teacher, seeking a teaching career and educating them?
A lot of what we've been highlighting has been, very kind of, it's not necessarily out of the box thinking, it's developing these teacher residency programs, trying to provide either adequate compensation and supports for teachers in the profession, mentoring. So these are a lot of models that have existed. I can reach out to my colleagues to see if there's any state this year that has tracked this issue a little bit more closely, to see if there's some recent legislation that they think might serve as a model for Georgia as you're kind of looking at the teacher recruitment and retention issue. Because I mostly track the K-12 funding aspects, and sometimes I will miss out on the details of what you're looking for. So let me follow up to see if there's a specific model that we see that is a little bit more out of the box than the kind of known strategies.
Thanks very much.
Senator Hickman.
Yes, I just have one statement. A lot of times when we think of infrastructure, we talk about roads and bridges and that type of thing. But we really need to add teachers to infrastructure, because teachers are the foundation. And what we've looked at over the last couple of years is probably the two most neglected levels of pay is law enforcement people and teachers. And I appreciate y'all's comments, but we need to add teachers to infrastructure. That is so important for our state going forward and everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Chris, quick question for you. Y'all done the similar educational background for public sector versus private sector employees. Have y'all done the public sector background for teachers versus public sector background for non-teachers that have the same educational requirements? Are they comparable?
So is this about the Economic Policy Institute's research? Because that is not work that I'm doing at Education Commission of the States. So I was
going with the wage penalty of 26.8 a little while ago. What I'm looking at is we may have a broader issue looking at us than just teachers. If we're looking at public employees across all sectors.
Yeah, and one of the ways that you can, I know there was an interest in looking at district spending and state spending, adjusting for the differences in cost of living, which is something that you should definitely do if you're making a national comparison. One of the tools that National Center for Education Statistics has developed is what's called a comparable wage index for teachers. And that's something that you can use in analysis to try to adjust for those differences if you want to look for disparities within your state or across the country. And that's a resource again, and I'm happy to work with staff if they're interested in trying to make that comparison in Georgia.
No, it was a little bit of the shiny object thing that, I got pulled away, but I just made a note for something totally different than QBE is looking at, if I got somebody that's working for DFACS that requires an advanced degree, how are they compared to the private sector average in wage? We talked about law enforcement. There are different degree requirements depending on what you're doing in law enforcement. How is that compared to the private sector? And we will never be the private sector. That that is not the role of government, but we need to be fair and actually compensate as justly as we possibly can. Any questions?
One of your findings was that all but 5 states have policies and weights in place to invest in the students with a poverty background, students living in poverty. And there are 5 states, Georgia's one of only 5 states that does not do this. Is that your finding?
Yes, we didn't identify that in our review. And certainly if we miss something, happy to work with you all, but we didn't see a weight or a separate program that was allocating funds specifically based upon the economic status of the student. And so that's why we didn't include Georgia in that category. But the vast majority of states do have identified some mechanism for allocating additional resources to districts to help support the educational needs of those students.
Georgia was one of 5 states for the hybrid model for as far as primary funding model.
Your speaker's not on, so he can't hear you.
Yes. Georgia was one of 5 states with a hybrid model as far as funding for pulling from both sides. I think that's the chart you're looking at.
Ask him if that's accurate. I don't know some.
Okay.
Chris, thank you. Really, we're talking amongst ourselves. It has nothing to do with you. No, appreciate this. It's very informative. But again, you and the others, I appreciate y'all help us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us here today, and I appreciate the great work the committee is doing. And please let us know if we can be helpful as you go forward. And I will be in contact with Senator Orrock on interest on teacher recruitment and retention strategies.
Thank you. I'm sure that'll be valuable.
It would be valuable for the whole committee.
Yeah.
I think.
Well,
I mean, to provide it to more than just me is what I was saying. But
well, you'll get it to us, right?
no, I don't. I'm not staffed at that level. We're understaffed.
I tell you what, Chris, Ethan.styles.senate.ga.gov.
Yeah, we've been in contact with Ethan. I'll get it to Ethan.
Thank you. Appreciate you, brother. Thank you. All right. We're going back to the 2 minutes per for the public discussion here. Is Zena come in? Zena, you're up. Zena, if you would go to the podium, please. Yes, up there. Okay, and while Zena's getting set, James W., you're next. And then Alex A. is after that. So Zena. Did I pronounce that right? Zena. Okay, sorry.
Good afternoon. My name is Zina Mohammed. I am a 2020 graduate of the Gannett School of Science, Mathematics, and Technology, GSMST. I'm here today to provide you with a perspective of the inadequacies in student transportation fueled by the QBE funding system. When I attended high school, I would wake up every morning at 5 a.m. to catch my first bus at 6:10 in the morning. That would drop me off at at a local high school where I would wait for roughly 30 minutes. From then, I would take a second bus from my local high school to GSMST and quickly pace to my 8 a.m. classes. After 7 hours of classes, I would take a bus from GSMST to a local middle school where I would wait for roughly an hour, and then a final bus from my middle school to a neighborhood stop, and then walk a block to my house. Usually, I would get home at 4:30 p.m. That meant from 6 o'clock in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon, 10 to 11 hours each day, I was either riding one of 4 buses or attending classes. Perhaps my 11-hour school day would have been easier if conditions on these buses weren't so miserable. Very few buses had working ACs. There was a consistent countywide bus driver shortage throughout my entire K-12 experience, so it was common for routes to be delayed by multiple hours. Oftentimes, buses would be so overcrowded, students would have to sit 3 per seat. Building more charter schools without the promise that students will have reliable and reasonable transportation to them will not increase equity in our public schools. When lawmakers make these claims, I can't help but feel as if my experience and the experience of my peers aren't being heard. 98% of districts in Georgia reported deficits in transportation funding as a serious issue. I remember how miserable it was to sit in the scorching Georgia heat, crammed into a tiny seat, and desperately wait for my stop to come. Today, I ask the board to think of themselves in my place and in the place of countless other students. I ask the board to transform the QBE formula by funding transportation. Thank you.
Dina, you were 1 minute, 57 seconds.
James W. James, you're up. Alex A. Alex A. You're next. Go ahead, James.
Thank you so much. Everybody knows that Georgia's teachers are underpaid, and students know this too, but we don't always know it by the numbers. We know it by what we see. And students in our public schools have grown up watching our teachers come in on the first week of school with bags and bags of supplies, snacks, and tools that they have bought themselves. We've seen our teachers say that I don't want to lead a club or I don't want to coach a team because they knew that their time would not be truly valued. We have watched our teachers put their own children's needs aside to fund their classrooms and to take care of students who they knew were in more need than their own children. And so Georgia's children, we've always grown up watching and knowing that our teachers were underpaid and just not knowing it the way that you may know it on paper. And so on paper, it's easy to say, our teachers are underpaid, they deserve more, we need to do better, we're not the private sector this and that. But actually being in a classroom and watching our teachers struggle is something that students shouldn't have to see in our public schools in Georgia. And so I'm asking you to consider more funding for our teachers. We know they deserve it, we know they need it, and now it's time for us to do it. So thank you.
Yep. Oh, well, these are all with Gwinnett. Not yet. Alex, if you would, tell me your name is Alex and tell me what organization you're with. We need that for the record.
Okay. The Georgia Youth Justice Coalition.
And your name is Alex.
Alex Ames.
Okay, Alex, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alex. I went to public school in Georgia my whole life. My parents actually moved from Texas, where they were teachers, to Georgia because it had better teacher pay. But that difference we were talking about between the public and private sector is in fact shocking, and students see the consequences. One thing I wanted to bring up as well is counseling and mental health. As both of my parents are teachers, they have students right now whose parents have gotten divorced during the pandemic, who have lost parents who died due to COVID-19 during the pandemic. There's students suffering from, learning disabilities, and they go to their counselor when they're struggling with a math class so they can get some support. And with a counselor shortage, what's recommended nationally is a ratio of 1 to 250. In what's recommended in Georgia is 1 to about 450. In my school, it was 1 to 700. It took months to see a counselor, which is really difficult for students. So this is something that we can definitely remedy with a better funding formula. To meet those national standards, it would save lives and it would make lives easier for teachers and students alike. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Julian. And after Julian is going to be Mason G. Mason G, you here? Okay, you're stand by. Okay, Julian, tell me your name is Julian and where you're from.
Hello, everyone. My name is indeed Julian. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, but now I live in Athens.
What do you represent? Any particular organization?
I'm here with the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Julian Fortuna. I have attended school in Georgia all my life, and now I'm a sophomore at UGA. Opportunity weight in our school funding formula is something that over 45 states provide in the U.S. And I think that, if Georgia's leaders care about our future and prosperity for all of us to come, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to transform our QBE formula and to help the children in Georgia who need it most. We know that family wealth and access to financial resources is one of the greatest predictors of academic achievement. If Georgia has over 500,000 students living and learning in poverty, that means that it's time for us to add an opportunity weight for those families. In my high school, disparities between lower income and wealthier families were very obvious. Black students and white students had different access to classes, opportunities, and higher education. Race and class made a huge difference for my classmates and I, and the pandemic only made that inequality worse. The pandemic has also exacerbated a crisis plaguing districts across the state, many with far less funding available to them than my own. Last year, over 30 educators left our middle school in 1 year. Every student here knows how important it is to have reliable year-long educators who understand the school standards, the community, and what the student body needs. When a district loses a teacher, students lose as well. An opportunity weight for students and more funding for our teachers would be a major investment in Georgia's future, especially for students who have historically been left behind. On behalf of my classmates, I urge you all to act with our future in mind. Georgia's children are worth the investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Y'all got this 2-minute thing down.
Yeah.
All right, Mason, before I call you Yana. Okay, Yana, you're up after Mason, okay?
Good afternoon. I'm Mason Goodwin. I graduated from Atlanta Public School. I come from a low-income, single-parent household, a story that is taught.
Mason, who do you represent?
Oh, Georgia Youth Justice.
Okay, thank you.
A story that is far too common in my district. Right now, your household, zip code, and race play a direct factor in the outcome of your life, with little nuance. Funding for students living in poverty would give a chance for students to actually achieve academically who have less privilege than their peers. Students that came from wealthier families were the ones that had resources to go into college-ready classes and to achieve academically. Many low-income students like myself had to work instead of focusing on school. We didn't have the same amount of time that we could put into classes as higher income students. And most of us came from broken household situations like myself. We didn't have access to counselors. We didn't have support to handle those mental situations while also having to focus academically. The question of alternative schools also came up. Alternative schools exist in urban districts as a consequence of the hyper-criminalization of our Black and brown students. Students that are in alternative schools are acting up due to consequences of poverty, not because they're bad kids. If you funded for poverty, less students would land up in those alternative schools, and in turn, less students would land up in our criminal justice system, which means you'd spend less money on policing and less money on funding our prisons and more funding on our school system, right? And then all of our students, no matter their story, deserve an opportunity at a future that can be provided by funding for poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason. Yana, you're up, and then Mike. Mike McCallan? Is that right? Okay. Did you write this?
Not for.
Okay. Did you write this? I must have written it. My bad. Okay,
right.
Yana?
Yes, my name is Yana, and I'm also here with the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition. So when I lived in Gwinnett County, I took a bus to school every day, and each bus ride could pose a new challenge for elementary school me to tackle. Some days the bus was delayed because it had to cover a different route. Some days our bus was so old that we had no AC. Some days my bus ride would be canceled entirely. In Georgia, the cost of transporting children to school can range up to $900 per student per year, especially in rural districts. And over the course of my schooling, Georgia has covered less and less of these transportation costs, all while our student population has continued to grow. For students like me and my younger sister, a lack of funding for student transport can have a major impact. 10 years ago, my public school buses were too old, too broken, and too few. And a decade later, these issues have only grown. Less money also means salaries for bus drivers are far too low, resulting in not enough Georgians funding these critical jobs. And I was lucky enough to live within walking distance of my middle and high school when I moved to Decatur, but students in rural and under-resourced districts aren't so lucky. My friends shouldn't have to spend hours of their day waking up far too early to wait for and ride on a bus just because Georgia doesn't invest enough in transportation funding. Our districts need new buses, more buses, and fairly paid workers. And when our districts don't have the funds they need to even get students safely to school, Georgia's children face the consequences. We deserve reliable, safe, and accessible transportation. So that's why I'm here to demand that we fix the formula and actually serve the needs of the 92% of Georgia students that attend our public schools. Thank you.
Thank you. McKaylin, state your name and tell me who you represent. And Isla? Something dash Rosa? Help me.
It's like Sanskrit to me.
Okay, she's probably next to Senator Tillery. Okay, Michaela.
All right. Hi, my name is Michaela Arciaga. I am the Education Policy Fellow for IDRA, which is an independent, nonpartisan education policy nonprofit. We are committed to achieving equal educational opportunity for every child through strong public schools across the South. And I'm also a former Atlanta Public Schools math teacher. We are here to commend this committee for assessing education funding mechanisms. And we hope that as you define your goals for this body, that you do so through an equity lens, which I know is kind of a scary word nowadays, but we mainly mean that we hope that students that are having the most challenges receive the most supports, particularly those students who have been historically marginalized, like students of color, students living in rural communities, and those living with limited economic resources. Nearly 1 in 5 school-age children in Georgia are living below the poverty line. Yet Georgia is one of only 6 states that fails to provide additional funding, which we have heard. We would urge the committee to consider an opportunity weight and to consult with IDRA and other nonpartisan school funding experts to ascertain an acceptable weight and that would provide our students with limited economic resources with everything that they need to thrive. Georgia is home to the 8th largest emergent bilingual student population in the nation. Georgia's emergent bilingual programs, like many others, continue to suffer from staffing and resource shortages. We encourage the committee to ensure these students have all that they need by revisiting not only the current ESOL weight, but also a dual language allotment, similar to what was described as in Texas with HB3, to incentivize the growth of dual language programs, which have been shown to be more effective in producing language and literacy outcomes for emergent bilingual students. Furthermore, we would like the committee to ensure that the funding allotted for education of emergent bilingual students is actually spent on their learning via ESOL-specific staffing or resources. Finally, Georgia is ranked in the bottom 10th of the nation for rural student achievement and has one of the lowest rates of per pupil spending in rural districts. We recommend that the committee fully fund categorical and other non-QBE grants, such as sparsity grants like Senator Tippins mentioned, and support our rural districts and communities with lower wealth. For these priorities to take place, we know Georgia should increase overall funding.
Sorry.
It's all right. We know that the committee has a big task ahead of them, we would encourage you guys to commission a comprehensive cost study just to understand the needs of our students. You have mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, which I also was a teacher during. And education is very different, and we do need modern, up-to-date data on what is happening to our students. And we would be happy to help and support through this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. Francesca. Francesca, and then after Francesca, Representative, you're on deck. You heard?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Francesca Rue. I'm here with the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, and in May I graduated from 13 years at Atlanta Public Schools. My high school, Midtown, is a flagship school in Atlanta Public Schools. I was proud to go there. I love the student body, but we deserved a lot better than the resources we were getting. Every school I attended, elementary, middle, and high school, put my classes in trailers for years on end. They didn't want to, they were just forced by overcrowding. These are not acceptable conditions to teach kids in. Rats died under the trailers. During the summer, the AC broke and we sweated and we were trying to learn history. In the winter, the heating didn't work. We were shivering. We were trying to learn math. Kids in Georgia deserve better than these like physical conditions that we're learning in. There are also like so many more issues that fly under the radar in our public schools. My school's never, ever, ever had enough counselors to support their students. Over COVID, kids just dropped off the face of the earth, and that was acceptable because there was no one to help them stay in school. Despite a well-documented mental health crisis among kids today, there are no adequate mental health resources, even after multiple suicides within my school, especially my high school. Midtown's 3 counselors were overworked trying to handling school logistics, and it just truly doesn't feel like there's anyone making sure kids are okay, that they're on track to graduate. Despite Midtown being one of the most diverse high schools in Atlanta Public Schools, there's also a direct, obvious segregation between the on-level and the advanced placement classes. There's a massive achievement gap based on how wealthy kids' families are, and the wealthier kids just get set on a pipeline for college and careers, while the poorer kids get none of the same resources that the wealthier kids get because the school just isn't making up for the wealth gap. And it's not, the saddest thing is it's not like nobody cares. It's literally just a lack of resources. So many of my teachers have poured their own money, their hearts and souls into teaching us. They bought us basic school supplies, and they shouldn't have had to. Our school should have the same resources to make sure that we have enough paper, calculators, up-to-date textbooks, and everything else we need for our education. We deserve better than the resources we have today. Thank you very much.
Before I get started, I have to say the future looks great. I mean, I have to commend these young people and their presentation. I mean, it was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and the entire committee. I'm Representative Viola Davis, and I came here today primarily to focus on those issues that is, as far as I'm concerned, affecting education, particularly in DeKalb County. I serve House District 87, primarily in Tucker, Stone Mountain, and Pine Lake. When they were talking about students in poverty, we have legislation, House Bill 10. It was sponsored by Sandra G. Scott, Representative Sandra G. Scott, and it would take into effect your SNAP, your different TANF, homeless students. It would take into account foster care and your immigrants. So everything that these students said, we have different legislation that is already out there about poverty. We just have to enact that and pass it. And I want you to also take into account the issue of annexation. Annexation in DeKalb County, believe it or not, moved $26 million over a span of time from DeKalb County schools to the school systems of City of Atlanta and City of Decatur. If you look at how many students passed in that 26 million, you'll find it was 62. If you divide 62 students into 26 million, you're talking about over $419,000 per student. So this issue of annexation is something, I mean, we did manage to change some of the laws, but we're going to have to really look at that also. When it comes down to these property taxes, we also going to have to look at what effect does these school taxes have on our elderly? I have sat in meetings after meetings and listened to our elderly talk about how these taxes are literally making them homeless. We're going to have to come up with a better tax system, especially though for the seniors that are on a fixed income. These are just a few things, and please take into account, we need a new system for those who have immigrants and refugees. Because we had over 74% of the immigrants and refugees placed in DeKalb County. These are just a touch of some of the things we need to consider with the QBE formula, but I commend you for having this committee meeting to get it started. Thank you.
I'm gonna have to stop picking on House members. You had 11 seconds to spare on that one. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I appreciate it. Representative Davis, tell your the other rep, Scott, you know that bill is dead because to your thing. So she's gonna have to reintroduce. Okay. And the more opportunities for success on this, the better we all are. So make sure she does that. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate everybody coming. This is, I don't know what you were expecting. Some of you were pleasantly surprised. Some of you are extremely disappointed. That's politics. But we're going to have several of these, and we're going to have conversations outside of these meetings where we start putting something together. But again, just to reiterate what we talked about at the beginning of it, the goal is to properly align the assets with the resources to best educate our youth in the state of Georgia and set them up for success. Thank you. Happy birthday. Y'all have a great night.